The new Alcatel FM radio phone from GT&T.
Program which looks at issues of interest to you. Welcome to tonight's program with Dr. Grantley Warren.
The year 2012 has come to an end. We are on to 2013. As is customary at this time, we take time out to review the situation in our country, stock taking as it were. And in our specific case, with the mirror and the holders of the mirror, that is, who have been showing us our condition over the last year, every day, they themselves are giving themselves an opportunity to do this bit of stock taking and help us evaluate what really has happened in this country in 2012. On this particular occasion, we have, to start us off, Stabroek News, which editorialized the year by saying, a politically forgettable year. The Kaichur News says, year of mixed impressions. These are the people who, in fact, make the news on a daily basis. And so let us hear from them. Mr. Adam Harris, editor of Kaichur News and co-publisher of Prime News. Mr. Arnon Adams, editor of business editor of the Stabroek News. And Mr. Enrico Wolford, publisher of Capital News. Gentlemen, welcome to Spotlight once again.
Thank you.
And let me start off by saying that let's wish all of ourselves a good one this year. For whatever sets of things we have as part of the media, would have to set ourselves some hopeful signs that we can help improve our current condition. Let me start off by saying, as we have done in the past, is to ask you which story over the years, you reflect on it, caused you the greatest joy to be able to publish. Couldn't have been that difficult.
Well, I always enjoy things cultural, and I was rather pleased about the Inter-Guyana's cultural festival that we held here during the August period, where Suriname, Guyana, and French Guyana came and effectively showcased a lot of the work that they'd been doing. I was extremely disappointed, however, that the kind of audience and the kind of spectator support was not there for all the events, but the opening ceremony was really, I think, an extremely good event for people to reflect on the sameness, the commonality of this part of the South American coast. And in fact, when you look from Bahia all the way to Cartagena in Colombia, along the coast of South America, there was so much in common. And when you took the three Guyanas, you realize, you know, what are the things in common that we do have. And as far as I recall, that was a great story to report on. I was but I'm talking from a position, for full disclosure, position of bias. I was part of the planning of the event, and although I was part of the planning of the event, I still felt the event was very, very useful.
Enrico set the bar very high. Full disclosure, certain openness. All right, Adam.
For me, I think this story. Well, there were two in the same vein that gave me the greatest satisfactions. Had to do with the termination of the contract to FIP Motilal for the road project, and the subsequent arrest of Sonny Ramdio for EasyJet. From the outset, we had questions about these people, and we were saying to the government, look, in Motilal's case, he wasn't qualified to do the road. We did all the background checks. He had never done a road. We didn't think that he had the money or the capital to invest in such a project. In Ramdio's case, it was the same thing. He had an airline. We did not believe that he, on his own, could have funded an airline. And we were proven right. And once we were proven right, we had joy in reporting the stories. I mean, we got cussed because they said we were the negative type, but it wasn't that. We were trying to protect the Guyanese taxpayer. We knew that in both cases, these people were not what they presented themselves to be.
Arnold?
Actually, Grantley, my memory goes back to, it's a clutch of stories, really. I remember that one of the things that the late David DeCurry said to me when I took the job and I agreed to edit the business paper was that he was primarily interested in shining a spotlight, pardon the pun, on
Well, I dare say.
small businesses.
Yeah.
And one of the ideas we came up with about a year and a half ago was that we would focus attention on women in business. And when I say women in business, I mean women who were doing little things, you know. I remember, for example, that we covered once a group of women on the Suzac Linden Highway who were into charcoal burning. And they were making a little bit of money out of it. We did a couple of hairdressers, people who were into some form of manufacturing, one or another. It might be mango syrup or tamarind jam or whatever the case may be. And what gave me pleasure in this particular instance was not so much writing or publishing the stories, but having in some cases those women call us up to say that something could happen for them. They may have gotten up some little market somewhere, somebody may have offered them a leg up, you know. And the reason why I felt good about that was because in those circumstances you feel as though you're making an impact, you're making a difference. It's not just publishing something and it comes today and goes tomorrow. I remember particularly in the case of the women who were doing charcoal. I do not remember particularly what happened for them, but I do recall them calling us up to say thanks, you know, something good has happened for us. And that sticks out in my own mind as probably the clutch of stories that brought me personally the greatest pleasure in 2012.
Excellent. With the good goes the bad. And so the very next question is, that story which you wish you didn't have to be part of. You didn't want to be reporting on.
Actually, if I can begin again, and I'm going to begin taking off a form of a segue from what Adam said. In fact, we didn't follow the FIP Motilal story as much as we followed the EasyJet story. And to my mind, that story, along with some others, that story was in fact a bad story. I think probably Adam and Kaichor News would see it from, you know, we told you so kind of position. But to my mind, that is a great disappointment, that persons who come to the country with an intention of investing are not properly checked, are believed to be who we think they are. And as a result in that, what happens is that so often we as a country, we end up being carried away by the lack of what may be called due diligence. And particularly for the two stories that Adam mentioned, the FIP Motilal story with the Mila Falls, or the Mila Falls, however you want to pronounce it, and the story about EasyJet. The history in terms of aviation, and I'm going to speak to the EasyJet thing, the history in terms of the aviation sector has been that these charter services come in, swoop up, and leave. Therefore, there ought to be more due diligence. There ought to be more questioning. There ought to be a lot more things. And just this week, the former executive of EasyJet said, well, he doesn't have enough money to represent himself. That is, when you're caught for fraud and so on in the United States, you tend to have to say that, because the judge then questions if you have big money to defend yourself, whether you're using bad money to try to clean up your act. So we've always had those problems, and we continue to have those problems, because in this era of easy checking via the internet and the quick movement of information, it's simple. So to me, it is a big disappointment, but not only for the media, but for the country.
All right. For me, this story I wished I didn't have to write would have been the story of this man, Blanchard, killing his 3 children. I mean, the death of any child is hard. A father killing his own children is worse. And that's a story that we did, but we did it because we had to. The public had to know. And I remember when that thing happened, I got involved in covering it. And I remember the story way back when a man also killed 3 children, Hendricks. He was released from death row yesterday. He threw 2 overboard and they drowned. And this was at Port Ryan. And he chased after the 3rd, who managed to swim ashore, and he cut the throat. Stories like those we wish we didn't have to do, but they're out there. I think that was the hardest story to report on.
Well, there were a lot of ugly stories in 2012. Adam made reference to a few. And again, I remember that there was a particular period, and both Enrico and Adam, I'm sure, will remember this, a few months around the end of the first half of 2012, going into the second half, when we had, over a period of about maybe 2-3 months, a daily succession virtually of women being killed in this country. I remember the pictures were coming up with monotonous regularity every day. In fact, I thought that the country was going quite mad at the time, that we were just killing off women for one reason or another. What struck me was the fact that here we had the media reporting on these incidents on a daily basis, but it seemed to me, from my own little corner as a citizen of the country, that we didn't seem to me to be sufficiently aroused by what was happening. I mean, you know, you would have a murder today, one on Saturday and another one on Tuesday, and they would be faithfully reported. But there was no anger, there was no sense of why is this happening, there was no sense of protest, there was nobody in the street shouting bloody murder or anything like that. The police didn't seem to be doing anything. And I started to wonder whether something was wrong with our country, or even more wrong than the things that are wrong at this point in time. The media, it seemed to me at that time, became a poster board and nothing more. People were reading things off the television or reading things off the newspapers or whatever, but I felt that the enormity of these crimes were so great that I started to ask myself the question, why isn't anybody doing anything about this? I myself wasn't sure at the time exactly what people would do or could do, but it is just the sheer incredulity of the thing caused me to wonder, well,
Yeah,
how come?
interesting.
If I could just come in there, grandly, with regard to the poster board, as Arnon said, so many times we get frustrated, and that's what I was talking about due diligence with EasyJet or with the Myla Falls or what have you. So many times we get frustrated, we do a story. How often do we have to do a story for civil society rather, the private sector, persons? We always say we are talking to Beatrice and Blackbush. on television, or Clara in Calcutta, or you know, Loretta in Lima, or what have you. The issue here is, what is the intent of the communication when we are doing it, whether it's in terms of the press written, whether it's in terms of television. What is the intent of the communication? We have issues of domestic violence, as Arnon said, and we seem to be numb to some of these things. But I want to posit that the reason we are numb is that we have various occurrences of violence in the society, and we tend to accept it. You know, the police shoot at people, and we tend to accept it. We think that is what they ought to do. People beat up people on the road. So the whole idea of violence in a society does not, get the kind of reaction. An amputee, and we're having a story today where an amputee is burnt in a house, and the way the story is written tells you, and the way what people say, well, it's like, it's a kind of good for he kind of story, good for him, if I could say it in proper English, that without regard to how do we treat with the disabled in society, how do we treat with the mentally ill, and it's something we've been saying in this I've been saying in the country for a while. We laugh at the mentally ill and people who are not of the same sexual orientation as we are, and we pelt dogs and crappos, and we think that's common.
But as in the introductory comments in this program, I did talk about you holding the mirror up, and when you ask yourself the question, what really is happening to us, I think Arnon both asked the question, provided in part an answer that is perhaps reflectful of who we are becoming, and we have to stare that man in the mirror and start understanding that perhaps that's not what we wish to be. Now, ever so often at large, as we are covering one story or the other, in our country, every politician, regardless of how seasoned he or she is, they talk about transformation, and we have to transform the country, whether it's economy or political relations or social relations or whatever else. What, in your reporting for the year, you would consider to have been the most transformative occurrence, event that you have been reporting on?
I would say Parliament. After the elections of 2011, we had the first minority government in our independent history. And that meant that there should have been a certain kind of behavior. The government is accustomed, by virtue of its majority, to having its own way. Now the opposition has the majority. Obviously, government behavior should be modified. That did not happen. So we had statements, the president saying, I will not assent to any bill unless I am satisfied, or my party or my government is satisfied with it. We are not going to accept a dictatorship of one, things like that, and when the elections results came out, I remember we went to a forum, I think you were there, Enrico, with the British High Commissioner. It was a forum by the Private Sector Commission, the British High Commissioner, the Canadian High Commissioner, the American ambassador, they were all there. And they said, we think this is the best thing that could happen for Guyana. And we were running with that. This is going to be good. We are going to get greater dialogue in the National Assembly. We are going to see more consultation on issues and what have you. That is what a lot of us expected. Unfortunately, we didn't see a lot of that. And it created quite a stir. I mean, I read in my sister newspaper, Stabrook News, for example, statements that the year was wasted, the parliamentary year was a wasted year, that nothing happened. We heard that when we became too critical, we got the flack for being negative, just because we wanted to point out to people what we think should happen instead of what is happening, and things like that. So that would be my contribution to this segment here.
Mm-hmm. Arnon?
I mean, Adam is my friend. We've been friends for years. I don't want to say to him, Adam, speak for yourself. But let me say this to you, Adam, and to the rest of you guys. With respect to the outcome of the elections, the mathematical outcome of it, and what could or should or would have happened in Parliament, I was never terribly optimistic, Adam. I have to say that. I was never terribly optimistic. I have become, and perhaps it's a bad thing, a little bit of a cynic about the political landscape in Guyana. There's a feeling you get that people have become steeped in their ways, and that what would happen would be that the government, for example, once it had discovered that it was in a minority in Parliament, would simply stamp and behave like a child. And on the other hand, you would have an opposition that would wring its hands in glee and say, we're going to get at them now. I sound cynical, but in all honesty, that was the kind of behavior that I anticipated. And in a way, I felt sad for myself, because it seemed to me that I was not investing sufficient confidence in the political process, in the Parliament. It seemed to me that I had felt that things were beyond change, except to say, of course, that in large measure, given what transpired over the last 12 months, I believe that to some extent I was right. Because what we had was a great deal of what I call pointless aggression. Pointless aggression in the sense that the huffing and puffing in Parliament and outside, it did not advance the political process any. It didn't do us justice as a country. It didn't do us justice as a society. And you made mention of that Starbuck News editorial, a politically forgettable year. Maybe it wasn't forgettable at all. Maybe it was quite rememberable, if there is such a word. Perhaps there were lots of things that were absurd enough for us to remember, lots of things that were disappointing enough for us to remember, lots of things that were politically sad enough for us to remember. Because at the end of 2012, going into 2013, sometimes you start a new year with a sense of optimism that, we did well in last year and perhaps we can do better this year. I mean, does anybody get that feeling? I don't know.
Enrico?
I can't even remember what the question was. What was the question?
The question was, what event or sets of issues that you covered over the year that were of a transformative kind that you
expected some transformation.
Yes.
In my whole debating cloak, we would then have to define what you mean by trans.
Oh, that is not difficult at all. That is not difficult. I preface the question by saying that everyone is holding out to us the prospect that he or she was going to be the agent of a significant transformation through some idea, some issue, some innovation, whatever.
Therefore, Grantley, I like to say this now because I've spent so many years now in the U.S. federal court. I agree in part and disagree in part with regard to what Adam and Arnon said. Of course, the political landscape, what happened in Parliament, what came out as a result of the election, all those things have transformed the society, but it hasn't transformed the actors, so to speak, up at the top. It has transformed those in the grassroots who now recognize that power really belongs to the people, who recognize, hey, wait a minute, we can dictate how the society goes by making sure that the legislature is listening to us, that by making sure that the executive is listening to us, and making sure that the judiciary will interpret and act in such a way as being a check to the excesses of the powers of those other arms. And we can now go through the media, a free and independent media, to ensure that that indeed happens. And I think that what happened with regard to the majority in Parliament will augur well for the society, because sooner or later people will be able to use their elected representatives on both sides of the House, or on all three sides of the House, and say, look, I would like you to do X or Y or Z. For example, I like to raise this because I raise it ad nauseum. The city looks bad, you land at the airport, you find litter all over the place, you go into the interior, people throw containers all over the place, and there is a tax under the Customs Act called the environmental tax that breaks in $1 billion Guyana dollars per year. And that money is intended to be used, I repeat, intended to be used for recycling, the cleanup of the communities and so on. And I think it is high time an NGO or the communities themselves say to the Treasury that money ought to be used for the purpose that it was made for, for which it was intended. And from that perspective, I think they could use the elected representatives, they could use the legislature from, as I said, from all three sides, from the PPP, from the APNU, from the AFC, to ensure that things like that happen. But I want to go on with the fact that every time you pass on the streets in Georgetown, in Berbice, wherever you are, the police just put up a roadblock, and they think they're entitled to do it on the Section 26 of the Police Act. And they decide to search you, and they think they're entitled to do it on the Section 18 of the Police Act. And when you read those acts, it gives them broad powers that they can do things like that. But there must be a point that it is excessive. There must be a point that it creates a negative image of a country, that every now and then, more now than then, you have to face a roadblock. And I'm going to give you one little anecdote before I end with regard to transforming society. I went over to Suriname to do a little project. The police stopped us and just pulled everybody out of the bus and so on and started a search. So I protested, as is my right to protest. Unless you suspect something to be stolen in this bus, what are you stopping it for? That kind of protest under Section 18.
Which police, Guyanese or Suriname? Guyanese
police. In Suriname, there is a regular roadblock, not a routine one, a regular one that you come to this point and you're going through an immigration search. This is just a search. Coming back, the same thing happened. But this time there was a guy sitting right ahead of me. A Caucasian, a white guy, sitting ahead of me. And they stopped the bus, so they pulled the back of the bus up, and they saw me there. They said, all right, go on. We're unable for Mr. Wolford make a fuss. So the guy turns to me and says, you must be somebody important in this society. Why
And
they
of course
didn't-
you said yes.
Why they didn't stop me. It's not what I said, it's who he was. He happened to be a writer for the Canadian Travel magazine. And he was, in fact, going through the Guyanas, looking at how easy it is to move in and out of countries, so that he would encourage visitors to come to Guyana, all the Guyanas, beginning with French Guyana.
It's interesting that
You see what kind of image we were portraying?
yes, no, absolutely. It is very interesting, and I trust that the public would take note. The people who are lifting this mirror before us, when asked on the question of what particular event or events they were deemed to have been transformative in nature, some of the things that were actually mentioned. But just in passing, Henrico, I think I wouldn't lose the opportunity to make the comment that, you know, I couldn't agree with you more. When I left Guyana for the first time to go to Ethiopia to work, I was really appalled, and that this was under the Mengistu regime. Comrade Mengistu, Chairman Mengistu. They were in the height of their socialist experimentation at that time. They wanted to be a little Moscow. And it was a police barricade literally at every corner, every 2 minutes, and you had to be awarded. And I could never forget the revulsion that I felt coming from Guyana in 1987 and saying, this is madness. I never dreamt that we could actually have gotten there. We will take a break at this time.
The new Alcatel FM radio phone from GT&T.
Somebody told me this. It's funny, huh?
Now, gentlemen, let's go through our regular checklist. At the end of 2012, is the society safer? What's your sense as you've been looking at it, running on the roads for the last 12 months?
How could we say the society is safer when we have broad daylight shooting of Ricardo and Trini? And in Trini's case, it was near a school, where people are gunned down. You may not like who they are or who they were. People are gunned down in broad daylight. I mean, as I was saying earlier, how could we say it's safer than every minute in the interior, where gold is booming, gold is doing very well, and we hear stories of, you know, a kind of Wild West operation where men are killed and things like that. How could we say it is safer when people have a legitimate right to protest and they are shot by the police? The police could argue from now until never every morning, as my mother used to say, as to whether who did the shooting or who they didn't do shooting. How could we say it's safer when Damien Belgrave is gunned down in a public square, so to speak, where people are all around? How could we say that the society is safer when every now and then the police stop you on the road, on the Section 18 and on the Section 26, because the police doesn't, or the police members do not think that it is safe? That is why they stop you. When cocaine is going in and out of the country willy-nilly, so to speak, I must, however, compliment the anti-narcotics units like KANU and the police and the one attached to GRA, that at least some people are caught here, but we're still to catch those persons who are financing the operations and how the stuff is coming into the jurisdiction to begin with. We have the GDF manning the borders, we have the GRA checking and seeing how much taxes, and they're trying to check me too. I don't have a problem. I got to fix up myself, right? If that's the case. You have the police who are supposed to ensure that the rivers and so on are safe. You have the maritime people who allow somehow Guyana registered vessel to pass Guyana's waters to supposedly send gold bars, because we ensured that gold bars actually went anywhere. How can we say that the society is safer? I mean, I don't think from all the stories that we have carried in the media that the society is even safer with regard to public health when you have maternal deaths and what have you. I don't think we could reasonably say so.
Arnold?
It's funny. I am not entirely sure in my own mind as to how I should answer that, because on the one hand, for me, safety can be narrowed down to whether I can sit on the seawall on Saturday or a weekend, or sit under my home and relax without being unduly troubled or bothered. And the problem with me is that I've always taken this society for granted. Ever since I was growing up here, I used to think this was the safest country on God's earth. And this, of course, is notwithstanding everything else that has happened. The problem is that once you think deeply enough, you cannot get away from the issues that Enrico is raising. Because once you begin to talk about safety, you have got to start applying the yardsticks. And the questions that he has raised in relation to instances of a lack of safety are not questions that can be avoided or averted in any way. So that, except you're naive like I am to some extent, except you grow up believing that Guyana will always be the safest country in God's earth, and as long as you apply the sort of practical yardsticks that Enrico is applying, I think you're bound to conclude that safety, I don't know, regrettably, and I say this with a great deal of sadness, quite frankly, it's tough to make the argument for being safer.
But
That's
yet you
my
would not make the definitive conclusion that it is not safe.
No, the thing is that it's a little bit of an emotional thing. I mean, I have to say
I
that.
understand. I understand.
No, in my case,
Adam?
despite reports that there was an increase in armed robberies and all of that, most of which occurred in the interior, I really believe that the society is that bit safer. Yes, we had criminals going into homes, but it wasn't as widespread as it once used to be when everybody started to put up grills around the house. We go out on the road and we have a drink, and some of us are still a little apprehensive about being out late, but nothing has happened. There are not so many reports of hijackings and carjackings and kidnappings. I think that the police really did a good job on keeping some of the criminal elements at bay. Contrary to the pessimism that my colleague felt, with all these robberies and rapes, and I still think Guyana is safe. There are many of us in this country who have never seen a crime committed, never seen a woman get robbed, never seen a man got killed. We might see the results of the killing, but
unfortunately,
I didn't
part of the
realize
question.
that I was a pessimist.
Unfortunately,
I thought I was being real.
Yes, the part of the question. I perhaps created part of the confusion. I should have said, compared to 2011, were we safer in 2012? So that we could keep it local. There's no question that there's a temptation one can make distinctions across countries, and in which case you may not necessarily find the kind of measuring rods for establishing what we as a society are doing. And this is, in the first place, an attempt to understand how we are evolving as a society. And that is what this entire review is intending to do. All right, now, is the society more just at the end of 2012 than it was in 2011? And lest Enrico ask me for a definition of what I mean by being more just, I therefore must say, does one have a sense that there is a greater equality of treatment across persons? Whether the institutions that dispense justice can be relied upon to so do. Some of these may simply be what one thinks, feels, what one perceives. But after all, those are the things that we are going to have to use to establish a certain element of whether there is enough justice or not. The institutions such as the Ombudsman and all of the tribunals that we have set up, at least in a constitutional sense, to do various things to help give a sense of justice. So that is what I would have meant. So I preempt your question, Enrico, and ask you therefore to answer.
Do you think this is it? The fact that we have an office of the Ombudsman, we have a public service appellate tribunal, we have all these things in place. The fact that we have these things in place do not necessarily make the society more just. I mean, it's like when the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index came out. Ms. Gail Teixeira came out and said, but we've signed all these agreements, we've done all these things, and we've done all these things. And I recall one of the directors of Transparency says, one thing to sign up to all these agreements. It's another thing to administer it. It's like the copyright legislation. We will all shout and say, oh yeah, we've signed up to the Berne Convention and so on and so on. But do we administer the law? And do we administer the law in a just, equitable, and transparent way?
And Enrico answers?
And that is the problem.
And Enrico answers?
That is the problem. I do not believe, just from what we have been reporting, and what the other members of the press have been reporting, and we began by talking about the Fip Motilal thing, we began by talking about Sonny Ramdio and what have you. We mentioned the issue in Linden and so on, that the society is more just. Whether you compare it to 2011, I'm getting a little older, so it's kind of difficult to throw my mind back as to whether it is more just than 2011. But I would say that it is sluggish. Yes, it is not necessarily a more just society just yet.
Just yet. All right, Arnon,
you know, I am very happy that I can respond to this one unequivocally. You know, when I look for barometers of justice and stuff like that, to be honest, and I don't want to sound vulgar here, I don't really care much about the office of the Ombudsman and stuff like that. For me, it really boils down to a number of rather simpler things. One of the things that you hear very prevalently about in this society are circumstances in which I might commit some kind of infraction and without any kind of consequence, and Enrico might attempt to do the same, and the wrath of God and everything else would descend on him. It seems to me that we are becoming far more steeped in a culture of inequality in those things where justice accrues to the powerful in a different kind of way. And when I say the powerful, I look at Enrico deliberately. You know.
Obviously, you mean the full and not the power.
There is too much. There is far too much of. I mean, we know of cases we hear of where the children or the relatives of the powerful in this country do things and nothing happens, and the average Rasta and here I acknowledge the presence of our good friend across the way there.
The audience isn't seeing.
Yeah,
Me now, cameraman.
Cameraman gets taken apart, for very simple things, so that
Or for nothing. Sometimes.
yes, or for nothing. When you talk about issues of justice and whether the society is just or not, to me the inequalities have become far more profound, and that disturbs me.
Adam?
For me, I would say, well, it's not a question of more or less. I think, as Arnon said, the inequalities continue. You still have a lot of ethnic considerations when people go out looking for jobs. You still have inequality in the judicial system. And it isn't that the judges would award a lopsided decision. It's just that the poor still can't pay for justice. He can't get the better lawyers, so more often than not, this thing. There has been no movement in that direction. House lots, there is still talk. Only yesterday there were a group of people from a place called Barnwell North protesting outside the Ministry of Housing. And a lady made an interesting point. She said, we've been living there for 25, 30 years. And you still tell us we were a squatting area, and there was this community in Lusignan that sprang up long after us. They have roads, they have lights, they have water. What's wrong with our community of Barnwell North? Is it because we're black? So there is the perception that there are these inequalities, and justice isn't really served. You still got people talking about one community getting all the developmental thing and another community suffering, and
Yeah.
No, but before I go on, I thought Adam took me on a line when he said about ethnic things. He was going to talk about the influx of Chinese. I thought that was
that was another thing. All right.
All right. I tell you what, you will both hold those thoughts for the next consideration at the end of 2013. And I want to ask you, look, we saw an entire election process being driven, among other things, by some notion of a sense of intense corruption which had befallen the state of governance in this country at various levels. And so it is only proper in this review that we deal head on with the question, do we have the sense at the end of 2012 that the country is becoming less corrupt?
No. There are still contractors who do shoddy work and keep getting contract. There are still people in the government who, when asked about certain expenditures and asked to justify, would either clam up or ignore you totally. There are still too many people who cannot account for their untold wealth, and these are people in the government who we know have 3, 4 houses when a couple of years back they didn't even have one. We still know that there are people, and people call us to say, hey, we couldn't get this job, the man wanted too big a bribe, I couldn't pay him. We still got one contractor submitting any figure, and more recently there was a case where a tender went out. Now when we looked at the tender, it was grossly inflated. We challenged it. And then somebody said, well, you know, that is what the engineer put it at. But in this society where everybody knows everybody, grandmother and grandfather and what have you, what's there to stop me, an engineer, from knowing Enrico the contractor and saying, hey, I can submit this estimate, you give this bit close to that. What's there to stop me from inflating it? And that is going on.
You want to comment on that?
Yeah, you know, the thing is that I have never been presented in my life with any prima facie case of a bribe being given or taken, believe it or not. You know, and
not even being asked or raised by the police. You may rethink.
Different
matter. The thing is, the thing
how
is,
we define bribe.
the thing is, however, that So that up until recently, relatively recently, my understanding of issues of bribe and corruption, it basically was located in the realm of what you heard from other people. Um, you know, one department of government or another. But you know what? A few years ago, I started to read the Auditor General's reports, and they were eye-openers for me. And I've never heard anybody in the government get up and damn the Auditor General's reports to hell and say that these things are not true. If in fact, and let me put it this way, if in fact even the modicum of the assertions and claims and pronouncements in the Auditor General's reports are true, from one year to the next, we are in a bad way. There is no question about that. We are in a bad way because there is evidence in those reports of all kinds of shenanigans. And what always amazes me is the way in which, according to the Auditor General's reports, public officials play monopoly with public funds, you know, with money that taxpayers' money and stuff like that. I mean, do you see those instances in which contractors get overpaid by how does that happen?
Yeah.
How do you overpay a contractor by several millions? I've never been able to understand how you get overpaid by. And
You fellas are of the median.
got
You're
to
so
become a
accustomed to asking
contractor.
questions that when you're asked a real question, you're not answering the question.
No,
You're
I'm
giving
always
another
amazed,
set of
you
questions. No. So what you're basically saying, Arnon, notwithstanding the
I'm
having
saying
not
with
been
respect
confronted
with respect to my education on the issue
in
of
more recent
corruption,
times.
Corruption
Yes.
is rampant.
The Auditor General has been of considerable influence in terms of my education.
Yes,
That's what I'm saying.
and that education has resulted in your assessment.
Well, it has resulted in an assessment, again based on the Auditor General's report.
Of course.
Like I said, and I said this before, we're in a bad way.
And I agree with Arnon, and
Yeah.
I think we've taken a position where we have a legitimate right to be wrong,
Yeah.
where we really feel
I like that.
that
Legitimate right to be
we
wrong.
have power, and we're going to use that power, even if we are wrong about doing it.
All right.
And that is what I mean by a legitimate right to be wrong.
Well, I tell you, in which case, the natural sequel to that, are we more democratic?
Paradoxically,
I would, yeah,
paradoxically, we
I
may
think
be,
so,
because
yeah.
as I was saying, people are more engaged. The young people are more engaged. The people in the rural areas are more engaged. The people in the hinterland are more engaged. The people in Georgetown are more engaged. They now realize that, as I said, power belongs to the people. They must be able to ask, why is it that Georgetown, the capital that has probably a third of the population, when you put in most of the region, 400 people who use it,
And the
do not
Chinese.
get a third of the budget to ensure that the place is well kept. I think they're more engaged.
But Enrico seemed to be suggesting as well, and correct me if I'm wrong, Enrico, that we have had to, in a way, wrest that democracy from the powers that be to some extent. Is this?
Oh, definitely. Oh, definitely. And
checking.
I think we are now realizing what democracy really means. And it does not mean you vote, you elect people at the ballot
And they
in
ignore
1
you.
year, and they ignore you for 5 years, or they ignore some of you
Yes.
Well, you have a point there.
4 or 5 years,
All right.
or most of you.
In whatever time we have left, I wanted to examine the operations of media, even as we reflect on it over this last year.
You didn't ask whether we are economically better off.
No,
Come on, the mega store open. Come on, get jacket. The mega store open. But I didn't see any government people go cut ribbon and so on and so on. You know, things happen in the society. Buildings were built and so on. Money is flowing in from somewhere. And the gold industry, you were formerly a Geology and Mines Commission, the gold industry has been doing extremely well.
Yes,
Even if sugar suffering a little bit.
I wanted to use this particular review for the socio-political style indicators. I should indicate our viewership that we will be doing another part of this review, as we oftentimes do, with Professor Clive Thomas, where we review the performance of the economy at large. And that will be part and parcel of our total assessment. We couldn't do all in 1 hour. So for what is left of this in this hour, I wanted us to, one, cast a look at ourselves in the media. And one, are we really living up to being that fourth estate in 2012? There have been many cases from time to time where we probably have been found wanting, and there may be cases, of course, where. Why don't you deal with that?
I'd like to make a point. As fate would have it, the three of us here were trained journalists. There aren't many others of us in this society. And I was trying to rack my brains to think about, like Andre still with y'all?
No.
Can't think of many others. So what we have, a group of young people coming in who we must train. And obviously they would be found wanting at times. The result is that many times we, the reporters, allow good things to pass, not because we want to do so, but because of our inability to really track down a proper story. So we have been found wanting. There are those of us, yes, who went after many stories, but we didn't follow them up. I mean, people call and ask, what happened with this one? We don't know because we don't follow up. In short, the media is not what it should be, and it isn't what it used to be way back when we had real professionals.
Adam?
There's
Sorry,
some of what Adam
Arnold.
said that I agree with, and there's some that I don't. In my opinion, in terms of assertiveness, in terms of aggression, in terms of reporting stories, in terms of openness, I think we're definitely getting better. I have to say that. I think we're getting better. I think there's some fine journalists in this country. I do believe that Adam is right, that a lot more training is needed, and I'm big on training because I really do believe, and Enrico made a point that's connected with this some time ago, I really do believe that if you're going to be a good journalist, you have to be trained. The point that Enrico made had to do with the crippled man in Buxton, and the fact that he felt that the story probably wasn't tackled with sufficient sensitivity. I think that's a great, big problem that we have. The issue here, I think, has to do with the fact that in very many instances, people are walking off the streets and becoming journalists, you know, and I think some of the media institutions themselves are not doing enough training. I'm not so sure what's happening at UG and stuff like that, but there is a need, there is a definite need for us to apply ourselves much more to training people. I'd like to see as well a greater sense of openness in terms of dialogue, and I say this deliberately, between the politicians and the media. Sometimes we feel a little bit like if we're the 10th estate rather than the 4th estate. I don't think that people who matter in this society, quote unquote, respect the media outside of Enrico, respect the media as such. To put it bluntly, sometimes I think we just pass for grass. You know, to be quite honest, I don't think that level of respect and regard that ought to be there is there. Adam is right, some of it has to do with professionalism and so on. But a lot of it, I think, has to do with the fact that there are certain spheres of this society in which the media simply doesn't matter.
I disagree in most part with some of what was said before. And I'll tell you why. Because I think we've had and we're getting some very good young journalists into the field, some young people who have done extremely well, who have ferreted out stories and so on. I think the program at the University of Guyana has improved, and they are putting out persons who can become good journalists. I think the Association of Caribbean Media, the Guyana Press Association, when they organize training programs, people are indeed engaged. The real problem I think we have, however, is that we are not informed before we seek to inform. So we do not spend time, Arnon, in trying to know what the story is. As Adam said, indeed, we just report it and we move on. The other real problem is this, that some of those who have come out of training programs and some of the people in the private sector feel that journalists are really public relations officers. We're really there to make people and things look good. If you want a public relations officer, you speak to public relation firms. If you want journalists to operate as journalists and reporters, then they have to be able to ask the right questions, but they must be informed before they can inform.
But isn't that a training issue in part?
It is a training issue
Yeah,
in part, but I'm saying the UG program, I think, has improved.
All right.
The number of young journalists we have, and we've had we've
All right.
had very good
Now,
journalists in the society.
The last bit of comment I'd like to engage you on is that in keeping with this concept of the building of the media, there are certain structures that must be put in place, some facilitating measures, like having the medium, whether it's the newspaper, radio, and all of that story. Do you wish to have a part and comment on at the end of 2012, because we talked about it at the end of 2011, about the state of decisions surrounding the augmentation, creation, stifling of the opportunities for the real media, the hardware, etc., to come out?
You're starting me off here,
Yes.
and again, full disclosure, I'm also seeking to ensure that I have a transmitting ability in the country. The lack of transparency, I think, with regard to how radio licenses were issued, with regard to whether the National Frequency Management Unit must or ought to publish all the frequencies that were allocated to all of the broadcasters. I think that is a problem. We cannot have a society where the National Frequency Management Unit just completely ignores the fact that the electromagnetic spectrum is a public resource. We call it a limited public resource, but with digital, I think it's improved somewhat in terms of limitation. But we don't know who has what and how persons were given. Let us take the issue in Linden, where the administration seems to be saying the Linden people called back for their transmitter, but the issue is not just the transmitter. The Linden, the green construction must have had a frequency, and that frequency is really the property. And therefore, if Linden, the community of Linden, has in fact the frequency, I hope the National Frequency Management Unit doesn't go back and backdate and change things and so on in there. But I'm sure somebody else will have a record, but they wouldn't do that. They're decent, honorable people, I'm sure, full of integrity. So therefore, we need to know who has what, who was allocated, just as how Geology and Mines Commission, if I could go back to your old workplace and say, when you have a claim, you know Grantley Waldron has a claim in Siru or whatever. If you have a claim, the sugar lands, you know who owns it. You know the Central Housing and Planning Authority that is responsible for schemes only, nothing else. They arrogate to themselves other things, but they're responsible for schemes according to the Act of Thinker Right. And the municipality would know who owns what taxes and so on. Therefore, the National Frequency Management Unit must say who has what frequencies. Then this new broadcasting authority or whatever could start to work. But there are other issues with regard to that. But for us to operate as media workers, we must be able to know those things.
Arlen?
I have a very simple comment to make on all this. And the summary of it, I suppose, is simply to say that Enrico is perfectly right. The point is this, that the way in which the resources that make media, particularly the spectrum, is managed. I believe that when we look at issues of media in perspective, it really is the government's Achilles heel, to be quite honest, as far as being able to make a judgment of its commitment to free media is concerned. I think it's the Achilles heel. That is, in a nutshell, what I want to say.
And I support
Adam?
the same thing. I support the same thing. And you have now a broadcast. What's the name of the commission?
Guyana National Broadcasting Authority.
You have that, and I think we passed we call it the Right to Information Act. We passed all of that. But even an official in the government said, yes, you have it there, but you think you're going to get any information? So indeed, we have the framework and all of this for good media, but we're not going to be able to access it. And that is the bad thing.
But why should we sit here and say we're not going to be able to access it? I mean, are we not at least entitled to ask ourselves the question as to whether there might not be mechanisms that we might be able to use
Court.
to attempt to access
The court,
these
we
things?
can use the court.
I don't know. I'd love to go beyond the court. I'd love to take it into the realm of probably knocking heads together amongst disciplined professionals to see whether there is any kind of engagement
There is
that
none.
might be possible.
There is
All
none.
right, what we will do, we will let these last set of musings be the subject of a discussion that would engage us all at the beginning of this year, and recognize the fact that in this review on the socio-political developments in the country for the year 2012, as seen through the eyes of the media practitioners who brought us on a daily basis what has been happening, it is evident that the sum total of the discussions, though it is always dangerous to try any aggregation of this kind, because weighting is always the problematic question. Which one is to be weighted more? But it is quite clear that the review has indicated a not too satisfactory condition on most of the indicators which were isolated for treatment at this time. One can only hope that as we move to a more open and democratic society, that we will be able to enjoy a healthier state of living as more people become engaged, hopefully. The next issue of Spotlight will be on the economic review of the state of Guyana in 2012. I'm Grantley Waldron saying thanks to our media reps, Mr. Adam Harris, Mr. Arnon Adams, and Mr. Enrico Woolford, for giving us their views on really where we are, what the mirror is saying, and hope that we want to change the image we see in that mirror. I'm Grantley Warren saying good night.